The Open Society and Its Enemies was written by Karl Popper in New Zealand, where he was teaching philosophy during World War II, and was published in the final year of the war, just as The Decline of the West was written by Oswald Spengler during World War I, with the first part published in the final year of that war, 1918. While Popper's book is arguably still today the work of philosophy with the greatest influence on contemporary Western society, Spengler's work has to a greater extent been dismissed and is perceived as being anti-democratic. Already in his introduction to the Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper runs into conflict with Spengler and his Decline of the West, where he talks about his dislike for historicism. What does he mean by this term? For Popper, totalitarianism was caused by the failure of democratic philosophers and the social sciences to defend democracy in the face of the insistence by philosophers on both the left and the right that democracy inevitably led to totalitarianism, a view Spengler also expressed in the second part of his Decline of the West. It is not within the power of philosophers to make such sweeping historical prophecies, Karl Popper claims in The Open Society and Its Enemies. We may become the makers of our fate when we have ceased to pose as its prophets. The future depends on ourselves, and we do not depend on any historical necessity. The Spenglerian concept of destiny, indeed the idea of fate itself, is therefore decried as mysticism. Popper's concept of philosophical singularity, in his eyes, is the rational thinking individual. This is the centre of all his thinking, and it is reducible to a number that can be counted, or, in its plurality, assembled into social groups, such as class, for the social sciences. In between there is nothing, or, if there is, these are mere number, i.e. arbitrary groupings that can be rearranged at will. An individual exists independently of their culture, their family, their traditions, and ancient philosophers like Heraclitus and Plato were just trying to defend the existing status quo, i.e. their own class. Socrates was to be lauded for his application of reason, the Greeks for their invention of democracy and the move away from tribalism, Popper claims. All metaphysics, he goes on, was irrational, and the true purpose of rational thinking man was to reform society. By contrast, Spengler ends his Decline of the West with a quote, Ducunt fata volentem, nolentem trahunt, from Seneca, which means the fates lead the willing but drag the unwilling. This reaffirms his own belief in fate. The introduction to a 2021 German edition of Der Unter des Armlanders agrees with Karl Popper when it states, the mammoth task that Spengler set himself, his hubris, already becomes apparent in the first sentences of this book when he writes, in this book is attempted for the first time the venture of predetermining history. The word predetermine, which the translator Charles Atkinson has used, is in German vorausbestimmen, and could equally be associated here with the German word Stimme, which can point us not so much to determining, but to the Greek legein, logos, the true meaning of which Heidegger tells us is seeing, speaking. Indeed, a closer look at Spengler's epistemology and his view of destiny shows how his approach to more rational than it is mystical. In Chapter 2 of Decline of the West, The Meaning of Numbers, Spengler tells us, the eye which can see into the depths of an alien soul owes nothing to the cognition methods investigated by Kant's critique of pure reason. Yet the purer a historical picture is, the less accessible it becomes to any other eyes. The mechanism of a pure nature picture, such as the world of Newton and Kant, is cognized, grasped, and finally reduced to a system. The organism of a pure history picture like the world of Plotinus, Dante, and Giordano Bruno is intuitively seen, inwardly experienced, grasped as a form or symbol, and finally rendered in poetical and artistic conceptions. Spengler's organic system of knowledge certainly differs very much from Plato's concept of the rational thinking individual. Popper is concerned only with the become, with that deemed scientific fact, while Spengler tells us that even the become is a becoming. It is still something dynamic if we look closely enough. All things become possess the property of extension, and are embodied in mathematical number, which contains in its very essence the notion of mechanical demarcation. Number being in that respect akin to word, which in the very fact of its comprising and denoting fences off world impressions. Rationalism in the Spenglerian sense is called in German erkennen, to know, but this is grounded in another form of knowledge, erleben. We see life, erleben, it means to see life, to experience life in a seeing way. We see it as the form in which the actualizing of the possible is accomplished. With respect to the property of direction, the possible is called the future, and the actualized, the past. What is being actualized we call the present, and which then enables us to assign definite meanings to expressions of a culture, and this is how we understand historical phenomena. A well-ordered world picture, Spengler goes on, is fashioned out of an indivisible mass impression as the becoming of the become, direction, time, or extension, space. Erleben has then nothing to do with empiricism in the scientific sense, but is merely observation of life. It's difficult to render in one word in English, other than to see, to live, or maybe to witness. If we consider a wine glass, its length, breadth, depth, circumference, its capacity, etc., it can be measured, but it can also be experienced in terms of how it presents the wine, visually, but also in terms of bouquet, how the glass feels, how the design of the glass affects our experience of the wine itself, how the wine sounds when we swirl it around in the glass depending on its shape. All these experiences enter our consciousness as forms of knowledge. What is more, they have been created by the history of the wine glass, which is more than just its manufacturing history as an individual glass. It is the wine culture that gave rise to this glass. It is the Erlebnisse, the life experiences, the testimonies of previous generations that have been incorporated into its possibly enhanced design. It is the biographies of the individuals who have worked in the industry previously. It is the Middle Ages and the Romans, and ultimately it's even derived from Heraclitus' observation that everything is in flux. In short, its presence extends eternally from the past until now. This is what the glass is. It is its being. This is all ignored by Karl Popper in his theory of knowledge. For him, it is all mysticism. Is this mysticism, or is it just reality? It's true history rather than its manufactured history. For Popper, the glass is simply an object, but has been made in the factory and has dimensions. It can be measured and has the potential to be counted. What is more, he takes the same approach to his singularity, the individual, the human being as a subject of the social sciences, which he objectifies as something separate from its culture, its history, its family, and its geography, something which can be counted just as a wine glass can. On closer inspection, Popper's singularity is in fact a duality. His true interest, as he says himself, is in radical change, which by necessity implies one individual acting on another, overcoming another. This is no different to Hegel's master-slave dialectic in reality, where there is a struggle to the death in order for the slave to become free and attain self-consciousness. A parable which Popper was himself quick to label as mysticism, since Hegel used it to explain all of history. Yet still it is at the heart of Popper's own theory of radical change, and this makes him no less metaphysical or mystical than Spengler, Hegel, or any other philosopher. Indeed, he comes close to recognizing this himself when he states, "We may become the makers of our fate when we have ceased to pose as its prophets." while calling it our fate and thus recognizing the historical existence of fate, a history in which he too shares. Like the eternal history of a wine glass, like anything other than the materialistic present minute, he nonetheless dismisses this as something mystical. Spengler, on the other hand, defines the destiny idea logically, which he claims in chapter 4 is the opposite of the causality principle, an opposition he calls the necessary foundation of world building. Indeed, he goes on, every higher language possesses a number of words such as luck, doom, conjecture, vocation, about which there is, as it were, a veil. No science can explain them. The arts and humanities, philosophy can, however. They are symbols, not notions. The destiny idea demands life experience as a grounding for scientific empiricism. In other words, Erleben is a prerequisite for meaningful erkennen, without which knowledge just becomes information. Spengler's logic is an organic logic, rather than the logic of the unorganic. The paradox at the heart of Popper's epistemology thus becomes clear. On the one hand, he is appealing to the rational thinking individual. On the other, thinking is only allowed providing it is thinking about things which are readily understood. For all his defense of independent thought, Popper, unlike Spengler, actually denies agency to the individual except via official channels. His work is full of a duality which can be unmasked as a singularity, and is not individualism as he claims. He implores us with his open-closed society dichotomy to defend democracy at all costs against those who question it, for it is precisely the discussion of what democracy is that leads to its downfall. We have to be on our guard to protect the open society, he claims after World War II, because we are already often closed off from one another, in motor cars for instance, where we inhabit our own private worlds. Needless to say, this open-close dialectic, which he devised during World War II, has been dissolved at the latest by the Internet and by other networks, by our being able to communicate long distance, even face-to-face nowadays, despite being separated geographically, meaning that an open society and a closed society can quite easily coexist. However, the extent to which this was ever a dichotomy in the first place is debatable. For instance, the invention of the motor car created new means of coming together, motoring clubs, motorsports. It created new conversation topics. It even created opportunities for the emancipation of women. And communication within cars via the radio, via phones, has long since been possible. It is precisely this that Popper tells us to be wary of, however. Culture is fine in his view as long as it doesn't claim to be knowledge. Instead, knowledge should be countable. He only wants wine glasses that can be counted, no individual aesthetics, only manufactured design, manufactured opinion, manufactured individuals, and manufactured consent. The end of the 2021 German version of Der Untergang des Landes, the end of the introduction, ends with a quote by Max Scheler, the German sociologist, from 1973. Die ungeheure Wirkung dieses Buches ist psychologisch nur aus der Niederlage Deutschlands im Kriege zu verstehen. The huge impact of this book can only be understood in terms of Germany's defeat in World War II. Certainly, the decline of the West added to the criticism of democracy in the 1920s in Germany, but at the same time it served to promote discussion about the possible paths the future might take, rather than just predetermining it. It sought to highlight the root of the Logos. Of course, the social sciences are today themselves frequently used to predetermine the future in terms of numbers. But which opinion polls or social forecasts predetermined, to name but two events in recent history, the fall of the Berlin Wall or Brexit? Were they due to the failure of the ideologies behind the project alone? Spengler's concept requires knowledge to be grounded in Erleben, acquired from living to see, or witnessing, eternal time rather than just space. Based on Spengler's morphology, we might have concluded that these grand projects were bound to fail due to the downward trajectory of society in the civilization stage. Outwardly, both projects failed due to economics, but inwardly due to a lack of belief in political ideologies. In the former case, the equality of all; in the latter, the belief on behalf of the British people in European unity, and the realization of this. In both cases, the financial and material overwhelmed the people's ability to see any logos other than the financial, which Spengler tells us is the dominating factor in this civilization stage, as it was with the rise of the financial magnates in the time of Caesar, or with the Yankees in the US. The British people looked back to the time prior to the EU, for instance, and the East German people looked over the wall to the comparative wealth of the West. The only logos they saw was the financial, and both peoples preferred extension to direction. The cultural tendencies of the people in question, such as the British tradition of exceptionalism and German Kantianism, the rendering of the categorical imperative as a rigid authoritarian system in communism, further added to the doomed nature of these grand 20th century projects. Yet in another age, in a time when culture was in full bloom, according to Spengler, maybe people might have been more aware of direction, and this would have led to these projects succeeding. By contrast, Popper's view of the Greeks reveals his rigid view of history, a view which might well have given rise to the projects above in the first place, despite his own dislike of Marxism. The chief achievement of the Greeks, he maintained, was to devise democracy and move away from tribalism. Yet Spengler, with his epistemology of Erleben and Erkennen, seems closer to the demos than Popper, with his denial of anything other than ratio, Vernunft, reason, analysis. Just like Popper, he claimed to be a cultural relative, and certainly he valued something of all cultures, not just the rational, yet he also favoured what he called the higher cultures, when the plant was in full bloom. For him, the lights of Goethe and Bach were expressions of cultures in their highest forms. On the other hand, he didn't think much of periods like the Renaissance, which he saw as betraying the classical ideal, possibly because of their interest in Plato and Aristotle, and of its sense of being a become period, an ideal which, it seems, like Nietzsche, he thought acquired its highest expression in Homer. In Homeric terms, he seems to favour the times when Apollo is at his most powerful, the height of the summer, the Faustian, the Baroque. The becoming is everything in Spengler, the become is the becoming too, and it finds its greatest expression in poetry and music rather than philosophy, which to some extent points towards his greatest contradiction. He is a philosopher who prefers tragedy, music and poetry to philosophy, to Plato and Aristotle. Popper too prefers change, but he rejects any questioning of what change is or what it is for. Change is good for the sake of change, democracy for the sake of power. Yet despite railing against tribalism, his system is a rejection of reasoning and questioning of truth when used for his system, and hence ironically a plea for tribalism with the eternal as his true enemy of the open society. Science assumes godlike properties more reminiscent of the Egyptian sun god Ra in Popper. God made man as a pharaoh rather than rationalism. His rejection of the eternal, cogito without a sum, a problem started by Descartes, compounded by Kant, and which Popper turned into a closed system, instead focuses on the mundane, the day-to-day. For instance, the being towards death which we commonly experience in cemeteries these days, where the day-to-day is increasingly found in the manner of Egyptian burials. in pyramids, our communication in hieroglyphics, the endless cat pictures on social media are all evidence of this Popperian influence, which favours the day-to-day and his rejection of the eternal Logos. This closed Popperian system, so characteristic of the post-war West, can be reopened, however, by a reading of Spengler. Of course, although Spengler should be lauded for his depth, it is still important to approach him with a critical eye. Maybe both Spengler and Popper are ultimately too narrowly focused in their appreciation of the Greeks. Perhaps it is neither their philosophy, nor their epic poetry, nor their tragedy, nor their mathematics that we should be in awe of as a cultural force, but rather the single uniting thing that made all of these possible: their alphabet, which is the basis of our alphabet and all the humanities. Certainly, Spengler addressed the question of the meaning of numbers, the natural language explanation, more than Popper's anthology of the social sciences does. Spengler, on the other hand, with his love of Apollo and Faust, appears to capture less of reality than Heidegger, who has a more positive view of times become, such as Renaissance and Scholasticism, while at the same time pointing out their limitations and extending these periods. Despite Spengler's dislike of the become, the decline of the West is a work that, in linguistic terms, has indeed itself become, even if it still possesses a degree of dynamism in how it might be interpreted or translated. Nonetheless, it has assumed the static form of a work or a book.